Well, welcome everyone, and thank you all for staying this late in the day. I know a lot of people have had flights and they've had to leave, but we'll hopefully make it worth your while to have stayed. So we are going to talk about that topic, and what you're going to find is that there's going to be a lot of common themes that you've heard throughout the course of this summit. And connecting or connected GRC.
Okay. We wait for a minute, so probably we can just take a minute. Yeah. Wait.
Okay.
A minute probably done. Then.
Yeah. So
not sure.
One of the themes here has been that GRC is not a project. It's a journey, right? And it's something that is part of life, will be part of life, will evolve over time, and having the ability to adjust and evolve with it over time is very important. There'll be some other themes as well as we go through this. So part of what we look at in MetricStream and taking that GRC journey kind of view is what are we actually doing on that journey? And it's really increasing our capabilities and our level of maturity in various areas of GRC and be able to deliver on the needs of the business as it relates to governance, risk, and compliance. So what really is the value of connecting the dots, and what is connecting the dots in the first place, right? So there's been many discussions on different aspects of GRC and that they're all connected, right? In compliance and audit and risk management of various flavors, resiliency, they're all component parts of GRC. They are all connected. And how are they connected? They're connected through information, okay? And so we'll be talking quite a bit about that. So in that information, there's three major components of information. One is data, that is master data, right? Definitions of risks, controls, processes, threats, vulnerabilities, et cetera, et cetera. Another component is transactional data, right? Performing control testing. What was tested? How is it tested? What were the results? What is the evidence? It's all transactional kind of information. And the last is things related to policies, procedures, other kinds of actual artifacts that you collect that are related and associated with the transactions, the activities that you're performing, and the information that's generated from those activities and the underlying data that supports those activities. So the value in having intelligent libraries is it's setting a foundation so that you can get to a point where you can make decisions faster, lower risks, and based on actionable intelligence. So quite a bit of what we're going to talk about in the next several minutes is about how do you get data from just raw data to actionable intelligence, right? Information that you can use to actually make decisions, right? You cannot make a decision on data. Okay, that's a very common misconception. A lot of people say, I need the data. Yes, you need the data to start with. You cannot make any intelligent decision on raw data. And we'll get into why in that a little bit.
To Doug's point, right, I think the important part is that I know we have heard in the last 2 days, right, like implementation, where do you start? Like, should we start with risk, compliance, or audit? So I think fundamentally what we want to talk about is, right, what is your foundation looks like, or your taxonomy looks like, right? I think your organization structures, because as long as you have a strong foundation, I think bolting on products on top of it would be very easy, right? So as Doug's point, right, we talk about raw data in the system, right? you're bringing your process, your controls and risks into the platform, but that doesn't help you anything, right? You're setting up the foundation, and then you're actually performing assessments and then reporting out of it. So actionable insights comes out of it. So, but I think that let's start with where do you want to start? What is the intelligence? Probably, I think that would definitely help people to connect the dots, what they have heard in the last 2 days, right? That's what we're trying to help you here.
Right. So well-defined data is a good start. The next piece is associate those pieces of data in a way that makes sense. And what does that do? It really gives you the ability to report things to the right people at the right time when you have all those associations. But one of the keys is provides a common language across the business. Because if you're talking a different language, using different terminology, different taxonomy in different parts of the business, you cannot intelligently discuss things in a common framework, a common context. And it makes not only reporting much harder, it makes communication and taking action that you need to take much more difficult. So when we talk about this, what does it take to get from data to actionable intelligence? Well, there's four main components. Your data has to have relevance. It has to have significance, right? You have to be able to interpret that data, and it has to be within some particular context. So when you look at, say, control testing and the difference between saying, I have a definition of a control and I need to test that control and rate that control. You cannot test and rate a control by its definition. You can interpret maybe the design effectiveness based on the risk that that control is mitigating, but you can't test that as far as operating effectiveness unless you're testing it in an environment. Where is that control being executed? When is it executed? Who's doing it, right? That's the thing, that context gives you that ability now. So I know the context I'm looking at. Who is it relevant to, right? So this control is executed in different parts of the organization, is relevant to those parts of the organization, and therefore you know who needs to have this information, who should own that particular information, right? It has to have some kind of significance, right? If I have a control that is totally insignificant and it really doesn't affect the business whatsoever, why am I dealing with it at all, right? So just a process of identifying key controls, that gets a attribute of significance. Testing the control and seeing what, the potential failure rate is, how does it impact that risk, how does it impact the business downstream, that gives it significance. And now to tie all this together, you have to interpret what that information is saying. And there's two ways to interpret information. One is to have a human do it. One is have a machine do it, right? AI, ML. Ultimately, it's a person, right? Machines can do a lot of the heavy lifting, but interpretation in the end needs to be made by a human being, right? AI can recommend things. So get a little bit more in context and focus and relevance and those components I just talked about. So when we look at starting to build data models and identifying what kind of relationships need to be made, we look at relevance. So organizations, parts of the organization, legal entity relationships, that kind of thing. That provides relevance. Who does this apply to? Whether it's a process, a risk, a control, the asset, who is it relevant to within the organization? When you look at the context and focus, There are many different aspects of it, right? So objectives, what are you trying to do? Process and function, what are you actually doing? Okay, assets and asset classes, what are you using? Right, systems and buildings and infrastructure of all types, right? Threats and vulnerabilities, what is threatening me? What vulnerabilities do I have? Products and services, right? What are you providing? Third parties, who's providing what to you, right? And on and on. So you have policies, standards, using frameworks, areas of compliance, et cetera, okay? There's many different components of this. So one of the things we have to look at, and just a very basic concept to realize, is that all of this context, this focus, all these things are connected. Whether we realize it or not, whether we accept it or not, whether we're addressing it or not, they are all connected. That's reality, okay? So dealing with the reality of the situation is something that has to be done. Now, when we start looking at, well, we have all this kind of information, and how many of these kinds of connections and relationships are possible? It's a staggering number, right? So when we start looking at this, one of the things that you want to try to avoid, which was brought up earlier, don't try to be perfect, right? You're not going to get there. Don't try to bite off everything at once. Focus on different parts of the business and what's important to those parts of the business and those functions within the business, right? So out of all those components, there's some key components based on different use cases. We're going to get into this just a little bit more. I'm just showing a few examples, right? So within the MetricStream data universe, we have a couple of dozen different data objects that we use for master data, which we've been showing. But for a vast majority of use cases, we only need 3 or 4 to actually have the system function and provide value. So you need to focus on those 3 or 4 pieces. I'll come back to that. And this is what we call meets-min approach. Another theme that you've been hearing: start simple, develop over time. Extremely important, right? If you don't take this route, and you try to do too much, you try to perfect things, 1, you'll never get there, which 2 means you failed. Okay, you've expended a lot of effort, time, money, and you won't get anywhere. So we have those guiding principles, right? Start simple, develop over time. Use that common language, develop that common language within the taxonomy that's presented within the system, right? So everybody's talking on the same terms. Collaborate, very important. And early on in a project, so for example, in implementation, so you want to implement 3 or 4 applications. That might be a lot to bite off for your organization at once. So you need to, although you may only implement part of a solution, part of what you purchased, it's very important then to have the right people involved early on, especially when you're talking about things like master data, your data libraries, right? Having a common structure and a hierarchical structure, so that at the upper levels of, say, a risk hierarchy, it's defining very broad risk categories, right? Key risks, you might call them, and then breaking down into subgroups and have those upper levels very well defined and locked down, and then allowing the business to define exactly what are those risk controls processes as they relate to them. Okay, so that takes collaboration, and it takes collaboration throughout a large community, because we're talking about the foundational data that all users in the system will have access to within their security limits, right? But it is common data. There are going to be common processes. So it's good to have people and always involved. And in any rollout, and Nanda, you might want to talk about this, building based on where there's the most experience in the organization, where current data might be the most mature.
Absolutely. I think, see, that's where, right, as we say, foundational things are important. Probably we have to start, like, where is your need, right? What is your priority, right? You know, we've been talking about different products, different solutions that we bolt on. But I think focus on the priorities, readiness. I know we heard Mike telling the whole, what are the 3 things that really need to happen when you have to go through an implementation, right? So I think there are multiple best practices. There's nothing like one size fits all approach for everybody. I think as you determine what are your priorities, what are your needs, I think you can start from there. That's what we call as center of excellence to support your processes to start with. As long as you are foundationally building out your libraries, right? Or taxonomy, it could be process, risk, control, assets, depending upon the use case that you are bringing, and also the organization structure, right? Because pretty much any software system, right, it's all driven off of role-based access, right? Security. So I think those are some of the foundational things that we really have to build first, so that you can build on top of adding any new products, any new use cases. It becomes very easier because they all sit on a common data foundation, or federated data model, as what we call. Reporting becomes easier. Everybody talks about the same language, right? I think the only thing is they view it in their different lenses, but the foundation is all strong. So I think,
Right.
yeah.
And the last point we wanted to make here is that there is no one right way to do
Right.
this. So when you get into the data modeling aspect, which we'll go through some examples very shortly, is that many different data models are needed based on different kinds of use cases, right? So what regulatory compliance needs in a data model has some characteristics that are very different, say, than enterprise risk or audit needs. Some of those characteristics are the same, okay? And those will vary, and it can vary based on your industry, where you operate. It can be based on many different things. So when we look at meets mid, and we'll go through a couple of different data models. So for enterprise risk, what's the focus? It's really risk to the overall enterprise, right? Obviously. It's really against objectives when you think about it. Now that also includes, well, here's what I'm trying to do, but here's also what I'm doing, and therefore I need to look at those risks as well. So when you look at this model here, and we're saying meets min from a system perspective, if you have your organizations defined, which you need to just for security, then enterprise risk, well, risk is central to that, right? And there's risk related to who you are, regardless if you do anything or not. Makes no difference. You have risk because you exist as a business in some jurisdiction, right? Now, for the system to work, you need at least one of these things. This is one of the most common, but the other ones too. So you have risk related to existence, you have risk related to what you're trying to do, what you do, and what you're providing, right? You have controls to mitigate the risk. So from a system perspective, to be able to start analyzing and assessing your level of risk in different parts of the organization, you only need 4 pieces of information. There's many more that are related, can be involved, right? And you'll see over time, you can keep expanding the focus and the content that you are using within enterprise risk context. But you'll also notice that some of these are more closely related to other things, right? So you have requirements and areas of compliance. Well, that's much more of a compliance issue. But when you're looking at an enterprise risk, regulatory impact is part of it. But if you're in the ERM part of the organization, you focus on this first. Compliance will be focusing on this first. The fact that they're doing that exposes that to you. The relationships here then provide connecting those dots. And that one example, just connecting enterprise risk to compliance. 2 different groups having different focus, using actually a different data model, sharing common data in a common context, can see the significance from a compliance perspective as well as an enterprise risk perspective. Okay? And you have different people within those different organizations interpreting that information in their own context. Okay? Operational risk. What are 4 main pieces? Basically, it's the same as enterprise risk. So for the system to function, that's all you really need. Or the more you build out over time, is the more expansive, the more complete your picture is in giving insights into other areas of the business, what's common. Okay? Because what will happen is, so for example, if I'm assessing the risk related to performing some kind of process, if there's some regulatory obligation related to that, that's very important information. Now, testing the controls from a regulatory compliance standpoint is not going to be done probably operational risk. But that information is available because you've connected it. Okay? Another example, regulatory compliance. Different focus, very similar data attributes, a little bit different in how you connect them. IT security. Some of the core components, all the same. Many are different, right? So the context is different. The relevance and significance based on who's looking at it can be different. But the dots are connected. So when we hear a lot of conversations about connecting the dots between compliance and audit, et cetera, that's what it's all based on, right? You cannot connect the dots without connecting the data. That is what drives everything. So that's why we call it foundational. That establishing what that organizational structure is, that common taxonomy of what do you do, what are you trying to do, what do you own, who you rely on, et cetera, is all part of that overall picture. Okay? So in MetricStream, there is no set data model, right? Many systems that you're probably used to have fixed data models. That's fine, but it's not flexible. And it also prevents really connecting all the GRC kind of connections that you need. It becomes very limiting. So in the foundation and in the libraries, the way that they're set up is you define what are the relationships based on different use cases being supported. What do I need for my function, what I'm trying to do? Okay. And if I understand that, then I define what that data model needs to be for me so I can perform the activities that I need to within my part of the organization, and I can effectively report out on what's being done, what has been found, what are you doing about any particular issues that might have arisen. Okay? So having that sound hierarchical data structure supports many different things, right? So hierarchical structures allow for data aggregation and roll-up, okay, which is very important. So for example, if I'm assessing very specific risks within a part of an organization, and these risks are related to, say, some aspect of data privacy. If you don't have that in the risk in a hierarchical structure, now you have many, many different risks, all with different kinds of rating. And you can't interpret that, right? Because at that level, and if I look at an overall context of data privacy or security at a much higher level, if I have 200 risks that are being evaluated in various different parts of the organization, and I want to see what does the overall picture of this look like, it's almost impossible to do, right? So by having a hierarchical structure and defining what kind of breakdown do I have, then when you assess at a lower level, you're able to roll that up and aggregate that so you can see at higher levels of the risk hierarchy or the organizational hierarchy in some process context. I can then say, what is the overall effect of all these different risks within this higher level context? Okay, make sense? Okay, and so by doing this, a couple of things to avoid: ambiguity and redundancy in data relationships. As soon as they're ambiguous or redundant, it muddies the water. It makes it much harder to see what's really going on, right? So if I, for example, if within different parts of the organization, I have basically is the same control, but described different ways, when I do testing on that and I have an issue and I have a control, this control failed in this part of the business within this control environment. Well, if another part of the business defines that control in the same way, in a different way, and they have a problem, it looks like two isolated problems. It's not. It's the same thing. Okay? So for example, we have a customer operates in 140 countries. And each one of those countries operates very autonomously, or at least within a regional structure, but there's a tremendous amount of autonomy. So what ends up happening over time is you have 140 countries. And say they have the same risk is common for 140 countries. The same risk. They define it differently. It's the same risk, but it's worded differently, right? The name is different. The description is a little bit different. Now you have 140 risks. So if You have, oh, this risk is very high here, and I have a completely different risk, and it's high there. Okay, well, I have two different things going on. But in fact, what you have is for that same risk, when you look at it at an aggregated kind of view, it's a different picture entirely. Same goes with control testing, right? I have a control failure here. I have a control failure there. They're worded differently. They're named differently. It's not apparent that they're the same thing. But what the control actually is the same, okay? It just really hides what's really going on, right? And that can be a real problem. Now, depending in different situations, right? And then you can expand on this a little bit, that, you know, in some cases, some customers, when they're implementing a new system, they might have some pretty good data, and that's great. More often than not, data is coming out of a legacy system, been used for quite a while, maybe didn't have great data governance, maybe didn't have great modeling set up and structure. So it's many times could be very difficult to use, all right? Now, the task of rationalizing all of that, standardizing all of that, can be extremely time-consuming and difficult. So there's a couple of steps to take, right? The first one that you should have as far as part of your data governance and management and policy structure is definitions of how do you define a risk? How do you define a control? How do you define a process, right? There are components to these things that really should exist, right? So for a process, it's inputs, it's activity, it's output. That's what a process is. It's plain and simple. If you describe those three things in a process, you've described a process. It's not about where is this process executed. That's not part of a definition of a process. Where it's executed from a definition standpoint is irrelevant, okay? Where it's executed from a risk assessment and other types of perspective is everything, okay? You don't want to confuse the two. So it's very important to make sure that all your data definitions are clear, your relationships are clear. And I think we're about out of time, and right. I think we're out of slides too. But hopefully this, you know, the real purpose of going through this is to really establish that in connected GRC, right? GRC is connected. All aspects are connected, period, right? That's reality. It is. How do you deal with that? How do you make sure that you leverage and are able to connect all those different pieces so that you can have connected GRC so your program's effective? That's the basis of how you do it, right? We have lots of workshops that we do on this and drill down to lots of different levels of detail. But in essence, that's what it's about, okay? Connecting GRC through connecting data.
I think this is a subject that Doug and I can talk for hours. I think we're short of time, but we're happy to take any questions. We are here outside. Any specific topic, happy to take. And again, thanks for the time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.